History of the Great American Depression. During the past 3 years or so, I visited various parts of the country and talked to hundreds of survivors of that period in the 30s. Embattled farmers, unemployed miners, Wall Street brokers, men organizing the CIO, industrialists who fought it, bootleggers, people who were children during that time, remembering their fathers and a sense of shame on not being able to provide. New dealers in Washington, anti-new dealers, and young people of today. What does the Depression mean to them? In a sense, this book is perhaps what the generation gap may be all about. Of the more than 150 people whose profiles and memories are in this work, we'll hear fragments of three who remember. The first is Jim Sheridan, who took part in the Bonus March, World War I veterans converging on Washington in the early months of 1932, when Herbert Hoover was still president.
These fellows had come with their families and by themselves, sometimes with their wives. They came mostly by boxcar. And so, can you imagine women and children riding boxcars? That's actually what happened.
Well, many of the bonus marchers took their families with them.
Because after all, many of these bonus marchers had been evicted from their flats or their houses because they hadn't the rent to pay. Probably they owed the landlord 3 or 4 months' rent, maybe sometimes more. And some of them were evicted, and some of them just left and left their furniture behind them. Oh, in a boxcar, sometimes there'd be 50 or 60 people in a boxcar.
That many.
That many. We had reached a place in Virginia. It was a very hot day, and I noticed that in this jungle there was a man, very tall man, about 6 feet tall. He had a woman with him who was his wife, and several small children, and an infant. The infant, I don't think, was a year old yet. And they were we invited them over to have something to eat with us, and they refused. Well, I could see that the baby was crying from hunger. Finally, me and some others went down to the center of town, and I figured probably that they didn't have any bottle to feed the baby with or any milk. And I remember going into a drugstore and seeing the druggist and bumming a baby bottle with a nipple. Now, can you imagine a guy bumming a baby bottle in a nipple? It took me a great deal of guts to work it up, but I went in and I told the fellow I wanted a baby bottle and a couple of nipples, and I explained the circumstances. Then I went and bummed the milk. When I got back to the jungle camp, it was kind of dark. I addressed myself to the man's wife, and I told her here was a baby bottle and here was some milk. We had even warmed up the milk. But she looked at the husband, and the husband said he didn't want it. And what could I do about it but just feel blue? The pride of this fellow fascinated me, but here he was subjecting his wife and his children to unnecessary hardships because of his extreme pride. Going through the tunnel, the baby died. Probably one of the unreported tragedies of that bonus march. When we got to Washington, there was quite a few there, people, ex-servicemen there before us, and there was no arrangement for housing. Most of the men that had their wives and children were living in what they called Hoovervilles at the time. These were on what was known as the Anacostia Flats, were across the Potomac River, and they had set up housing there made of cardboard and tin of all kinds. Most other contingents, there was along Pennsylvania Avenue, they were tearing down a lot of buildings, and a lot of the ex-servicemen just sort of turned them into barracks. They sort of bunked there. Garages that were to be turned down, that was vacant, they took over these garages, had no respect for private property, didn't even ask permission of the owners. They didn't know who the hell the owners was. Okay, they would hold midnight vigils around the White House. They would march around the White House practically in shifts. They were ordered out of Washington 4 or 5 times, and they refused. The one that they did get to shove these bedraggled ex-servicemen out of Washington was none other than the great MacArthur. When these ex-soldiers wouldn't move, they'd poke them with their bayonets or hit them on the head with the butt of the rifle. As night fell, they were given orders to get out of the Anacostia Flats. They refused, and they crossed there, and the soldiers set those shanties that these people were living in on fire. They threw gas. They threw gas at them too, and so the bonus marchers straggled back to the various places they came from, and without their bonus.
The Battle of Anacostia Flats is remembered by a survivor. A former Senator William Benton founded an advertising agency a few months before the stock market crashed.
The clients, when I called upon them throughout 1929, instead of paying attention to their business, were picked up with the speculative fever of the purchase and sale of stocks on the stock market. And I would sit there trying to talk to them about advertising and trying to get them to listen to the points I wanted to make about the coming development of radio. And the phone would ring, and there would be a continuing sequence of interruptions talking about the stock market. We started on July 15th, 1929. This was the very day of the all-time peak of the stock market price index. It started to slip away on July 16th, and later I solicited business, and my chart was a kind of cross. The left-hand line started way up at the top corner and ended up in the bottom right-hand corner. That was the stock market index. The other line that made the cross was Benton and Bowles. It started at the bottom left-hand corner and ended up in the top right-hand corner. So as the stock market went down and plummeted into oblivion, Benton and Bowles went up into stardom. So that when I sold the agency in 1935, it was the biggest single office in the world. I benefited out of the Depression. I was only 29 and Bowles was only 28. We just turned 29 and 28. When things are prosperous, I don't think the big advertisers and the big clients are as likely to listen to young men. They're not as likely to listen to new ideas either. In 29 at Pepsi, sales were all 50%, and none of the old-type advertising seemed to work. In May of 1929, I left my office, and I walked home to my apartment next to the Webster Hotel. It was a hot and muggy night. All the doors and windows were open, and I heard these colored voices sweeping out into the street from all the apartments and houses, and I turned around and walked back up the street. There were 19 radios tuned on, and 17 were tuned into Amos and Andy. This is the first audience research survey in the history of radio broadcasting. And I went the next mornings, and I said, we ought to buy Amos and Andy right away for Pepsi because somebody's going to buy them very soon. We did. We bought them on the spot. And within a matter of weeks, it was the greatest sensation in the history of the American show business. And Pepsi sales skyrocketed, and the crash never touched Pepsi.